This is the Mesra Directive 4.9. This directive says that a function should be used in preference to a function like macro where they are interchangeable. So in C programming, sometimes there is a choice to define a macro such as the min and the max of two integers. Can use a macro to define the implementation of the min and the max. You can also use a C function to define min and a max. The directive is saying that if you have a choice with either of these methods to define a macro or a function, then your preference should be to use the function style of definition. Unless there are some limitations that will prevent you from using a function, and only then will a macro is acceptable. Okay, so these are the things that should be considered when you decide whether to use a function or a macro, and whether this is also the things to be considered such that the use of a macro or a function is compliant to the Mesra standard. 1. The benefits of function methodology is the type check. Second, if you are using C99, C programming variant, you will have the inline functions, but take note that the inline keyword is only a suggestion by the programmer to and whether the function is inline or not depends on two factors. The first factor is if the parameters of the function are constant, then they can be inline. If some of them can only be resolved at runtime, then even though you put inline, the intention of being inline will not be granted. The second factor is it has a dependency to the compiler. So it depends on the compiler whether your inline intention is satisfied or not. Next, so in the guideline of Mesra, there is a trade-off between code size and execution speed. So you will be excused by Mesra, okay, whether you use a function or a macro based on this trade-off. If you use a macro, the code size will be bigger and the execution speed of the compiled program is faster. So if you want it, then you will be excused to use a macro because of these considerations of code size and execution speed. If you use a function, then the code size will be smaller and and the execution speed of the compiled binary will be slower. So based on these considerations and trade-off are valid justification whether a macro or function should be used. Next, whether the possibility for compile time evaluation is important. So a macro with constant arguments are more likely to be evaluated at compile time because all of these things in the macros parameter are constant, so they will be finalized at compilation. There is no more left unknown that can only be resolved at runtime. So if you prefer that, then you use macro. Next, whether the arguments would be valid for a function. So this is simple as search and replace. If the argument forced to use function. Next, ease of understanding and maintainability. Now this is a context whether a function or a macro is more understandable or which is more maintainable depends on the body of the macro or a function, case-to-case basis, based on the judgment of the programmer. So here are some examples. We see here the macro eval underscore bin op. This eval underscore bin op can only be a macro. There is no way to create a function eval underscore bin op because of the operator as one of the argument. So a macro here is mandatory. Next, in the void f void function, because the variable x inside the function has a static storage duration, you cannot use a function dev2. You are forced to use a macro. Because this is forced, then macro is unavoidable. It is okay. It is compliant. However, the y variable declaration is using a macro even if a function is okay. In this case, this is a deviation of the Measure guidelines. The Measure guidelines states that if a function is possible to be used, then you should use a function. You should only use a macro if there's no other way to do it. And this is what the guideline is all about. The guideline does not totally preclude macros. Instead, it just is referencing the use function over macro. But then macro still have their place in C programming because there are constructs that are only possible via macro.